Now, as I said this morning, of course, these are my own views, but they are based on facts. I try to do that. We can have three main perspectives on the use of force in psychiatry, and I will use antipsychotics as an example because that is the type of drug that is likely most commonly used in force treatment. We can look at it in a scientific fashion. Does force do more good than harm? I am convinced that it doesn't, but it's difficult to document. It's a kind of indirect evidence. And ethics, is force ethically defensible? Certainly not. It violates informed consent, and antipsychotics kill and cripple many people. So to force people into treatment with something like this against their will is not ethically defensible. So I wonder why we haven't heard from medical ethicists. What are these people doing? This is far more important than a lot of their nitty-gritty daily work. Then we have the legal aspects. There are international declarations that forbid us to have forced treatment in psychiatry, but they are being ignored. And if laws are unjust, we simply must change them. It's very simple. So I believe we cannot defend forced treatment scientifically, ethically, or legally. First of all, what about the benefits versus harms? As Bob Whittaker said, these drugs are not specific in any way, and the placebo-controlled trials are highly flawed. You have heard a lot about this. Lack of blinding, cold turkey in the placebo group creates a lot of harm. And despite all these flaws, the effect in recent submissions to the FDA of these newer agents like olanzapine, risperidone, and drugs like that, what you found in these submissions was an effect compared to placebo of 6 points on the positive and negative syndrome scale. And what is the bare minimum difference people can perceive as a change? That is 15 points. So like with the Hamilton Depression Score, what you see with these newer drugs is less than what people can barely perceive. And what people can barely perceive as a change, is that clinically relevant? I don't believe it is. If you can see light for the end of a tunnel, you can say, yes, I can see light for the end of the tunnel, but I still can't read my newspaper because it's too dim. And please consider that the diagnosis can be wrong in more than 50% of the cases. So a lot of these people even don't have schizophrenia, and then you enforce drugs on them that might kill or cripple them. This is simply something we should be terribly ashamed about. So I cannot understand this just goes on. Then we could ask, what about the benzodiazepines? I said a little about it this morning. The psychiatrists have failed to live up to their professional responsibility because they have neglected to perform head-to-head comparisons between benzodiazepines and antipsychotics. Why didn't they do that? Because they let the drug industry do almost all the trials. They have failed us and their own patients. 35 years after the first antipsychotic chlorpromazine came on the market, only 2 trials had compared these 2 types of drugs, and these trials showed similar improvements. There are now more trials, and a Cochrane review that showed that sedation occurred more often on benzodiazepines. That was 14 trials. They weren't of any high quality, but if the psychiatrists feel they are not good enough, they have an even more compelling reason to do them well enough. So perhaps we could get rid of antipsychotics altogether. Benzodiazepines are not nice either, and this may be my personal preference. If I were to receive anything, I would definitely prefer a benzodiazepine and not an antipsychotic. These are horrible drugs. I can see some people in the audience who have tried both. They are nodding. You can call this anecdotal. That's up to you. There is a huge but deeply flawed Cochrane review. It reviewed chlorpromazine against placebo for schizophrenia. There were 5,500 patients. The abstract says that akathisia did not occur more often on chlorpromazine than on placebo. There were no reservations against this observation. And the largest trial that contributed data to the review found significantly less akathisia on drug than on placebo. How is this possible? Antipsychotics cause akathisia. Placebo cannot cause akathisia unless you introduce a cold turkey in the placebo group, which is exactly what you did in these trials. Can you imagine any worse science than this? Well, I can, but it is bad. So this result speaks volumes about how flawed trials in schizophrenia are. So we saw these cold turkey symptoms. Now here is a much better Cochrane review, because these authors realized that we need people who have not been treated before. So they went after early episode schizophrenia, but unfortunately with a majority of first and second episode schizophrenia spectrum disorders. So these trials were still flawed because some of these people were already in antipsychotic treatment. He wasn't first episode schizophrenia. But what they concluded was that the available evidence does not support a conclusion that antipsychotic treatment in an acute early episode of schizophrenia is effective. And moreover, the use of antipsychotic medications for millions of people with an early episode appears based on the evidence for those with multiple episodes, which we know this evidence is completely unreliable. So here we have some Cochrane authors that say, what on earth is going on? But we don't see many of these lights, unfortunately. So this is a terribly important Cochrane review. Antipsychotics kill people, and we can't rely on these usual trials. And I told you before that therefore I looked into trials in people with Alzheimer or dementia who were treated with these new antipsychotics, and I also told you that for every 100 patients treated, there was one additional death on drug. I think this is so important that it deserves to be repeated, actually, this result. This is the most reliable information on deaths caused by antipsychotics that I think we have. 1 in 100 are killed, at least among the elderly. Now, those who don't die, they are often crippled by antipsychotics that cause irreversible brain damage in a dose-related fashion, less chance of getting back to normal life, dependency, abstinence symptoms, supersensitivity psychosis, and a lot else. Some of the most toxic drugs ever made, apart from chemotherapy for cancer. So is force ethically defensible? A few hours or days of disturbed behavior can be treated as a course for lifetime sentence to drug treatment. And psychiatrists in training will, as Bob said, hardly ever see a patient who is not already snowed under with drugs, and therefore get a wrong impression both of patient and the strength and the potential for cure without drugs. All these bizarre behaviors that we relate to schizophrenia are usually caused by drugs. I didn't know that before I started to study psychiatry. We were all fooled. Some psychiatrists feel they cannot live without forced treatment, but think of the patients, they cannot live with it. Some die from it, actually. That's far worse. It's not defensible because it's only soldiers at war and psychiatric patients that are forced to run risks against their will that might kill or cripple them. And power corrupts, and the power imbalance is extreme. There is a high risk that forced treatment is being used to benefit staff rather than patients in order to make their work less stressful. Antipsychotics have killed hundreds of thousands of people and have crippled tens of millions. Some patients who were killed have begged what they call their torturers not to get the drugs. And very few have been investigated for slow metabolism, although this is what kills some of them. And here is a heartbreaking story, and the mother who wrote this book is here today. It's a story about how psychiatry killed her daughter at age 32 after her 14-year so-called career in psychiatry. She was a slow metabolizer, but her psychiatrist refused to have the test done. When Louise's best friend dropped dead on the floor at Amager Hospital, Louise said, "I'll be next." Few will believe in forced treatment after having read this book, so please read it. The diagnosis was wrong. The psychiatrists didn't listen, not even to their own staff who knew Louise much better than they did. They didn't listen to Louise's mother. They consistently blame Louise and her mother, never the drugs or themselves. And they increased the dose when it should have been decreased or stopped altogether, very consistently. When Louise was dead, the system congratulated itself for its first-class homicide. Louise had received what was called the highest standard of specialist treatment. And the cause of death was called unknown. You don't suddenly drop dead at the age of 32. That's very uncommon. The officially accepted term for such death is natural death. Danish researchers have shown themselves that psychiatric hospital contact seems to be pretty harmful. There is a Danish register study that showed that the closer the contact with psychiatric staff, which often involves forced treatment, the worse the outcome. Suicide risk was 44 times higher for people admitted to a psychiatric hospital compared to no psychiatric treatment in the preceding year. And most of the potential biases in the study actually favored the null hypothesis of there being no such relationship. Of course, you would expect that people who are more ill gets more admitted to hospital and therefore commit suicide. But actually the biases in this study went the other way around, most of them. So there was an editorial that said it's entirely plausible that the stigma and trauma inherent in psychiatric treatment, particularly if involuntary, might cause suicide. This is what the patients know, that when you take the last hope from a patient, that now we are going to put you in belts and force drugs into you that you are afraid of getting, and at the same time perhaps telling people this is a disease you will have for the rest of your life, and you will continue with these drugs for the rest of your life. What is left for a person like that? Why do psychiatrists so often, I've heard this so many times, take the hope from patients by telling them this is for life? Why do they do this? This is bad medicine. Now, I know a lawyer in Alaska who won a Supreme Court case. It decided that the government cannot drug someone against their will without first proving by clear and convincing evidence that it is in their best interest and there is no less intrusive alternative available. This is Jim Gøtzsche, a previous patient who has also been subjected to forced treatment. And he used scientific evidence to convince the judges. In another case, the Alaska court decided that if an alternative is feasible, the state has to either provide it or let the patient go. Psychiatrists with a full understanding of the trial judges regularly lie in court to obtain involuntary commitment and forced medication orders. The judges accept these lies. Everybody accepts the lies, it seems. So the show goes on. And I was just told in the break that the Norwegian High Court case I'm involved with has been rejected because there is nothing of principal importance in this case, they say, at the Norwegian High Court. We must battle against this with all the force we have. We must make lawsuits, must convince the lawyers that it's not in the patient's best interest to get an antipsychotic. Now, the legal issues are actually quite clear. There is a European Convention on Human Rights that says prohibition of torture. No one shall be subjected to torture or to inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. And they have a committee for prevention of torture, which says that patients are often restrained, usually mechanically, as a sanction for perceived misbehavior or as a means to bring about a change of behavior. The committee furthermore says that when physical restraint is necessary, it should in principle be limited to manual control, using your hands, not bells. Talking to the patient to calm him or her down is the preferred technique. Mechanical restraint requires more, not fewer medical staff. Why does the committee say this? Because the excuse in psychiatric wards is we put people in bells because we are understaffed. But it actually requires more staff to put people in belt because you need to supervise them. Psychiatric patients should be treated with respect and dignity and in a safe, humane manner that respects their choices and self-determination. This doesn't happen today. And the committee all too often finds that the fundamental components of effective psychosocial rehabilitative treatment are underdeveloped or even missing, and that the treatment provided to patients consists essentially of pharmacotherapy. That's the reality we know today. Not a single randomized trial has compared seclusion or mechanical restraint with no such intervention, but these measures can be fatal. Electroshock can also be fatal. The fundamental human right to equal recognition before the law applies to everyone, also to people with mental disorders. This is clear from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and above all, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. As far as I can see, it has been ratified by any country in the world, but no one does anything to change the law. So we must work on that. And the convention is very critical that people don't act when they have ratified the convention. So 1 year ago, it said that member states must immediately, this is strong language, taking steps towards the realization of the rights by developing laws and policies to replace regimes of substitute decision-making. What does that mean? The staff decides for you. By supported decision-making, we will help you make a decision which respects what they think, the patients. So people have the right to be free from involuntary detention in a mental health facility and not to be forced to undergo mental health treatment. It's all there. Forced treatment is a violation of the right to equal recognition before the law. Otherwise, we don't accept that in our laws. It's an infringement of the rights to personal integrity, freedom from torture, freedom from violence, exploitation, and abuse. These are not my words. They are in the convention. And you will notice how carefully people select wording in conventions. This convention is unusually straight, clear language. That's probably because it's needed to talk loud to people. State parties must abolish policies and legislative provisions that allow or perpetrate forced treatment, as it is an ongoing violation found in mental health laws across the globe, despite empirical evidence indicating its lack of effectiveness and the views of people using mental health systems who have experienced deep pain and trauma as a result of forced treatment. Straight language again. Police officers, social workers, and other first responders must be trained to recognize persons with disabilities as full persons before the law and to give the same weight, this is important, to complaints and statements from persons with disabilities as they would to a non-disabled person. What happens out there? Oh, you lack insight into your disease, so now we will come and determine things for you and give you an antipsychotic against your will. This is deeply unethical and inhumane, and it's not allowed according to United Nations Convention. And an unsoundedness of mind is not an excuse for discriminatory behavior and denial of legal capacity. And please note that the concept of mental capacity, which is often being used today, that you don't have mental capacity, this is highly controversial in itself, because what is it? It's not, as is commonly presented, an objective, scientific and naturally occurring phenomenon. No, it's contingent on social and political context, as are the disciplines, professions and practices, and you might say routines, beliefs, myths, delusions, which play a dominant role in assessing mental capacity. So again, the power imbalance is just extreme in psychiatry. When it's the same people who decide on all this, now you can actually plan in advance if you fear that you will become insane, and you can give your directives where you state your will and preferences, and these should then be respected at a time when you may not be in a capacity to say what you want. So there you can say never, never an antipsychotic, never, never electroshock. Please respect me. And please respect my wife or my husband if they say that these other drugs should not be used either. The point at which such an advance directive enters into force and ceases to have effect should be decided by the person and included in the text of the directive, and it should not be based on an assessment that the person lacks mental capacity, because then we are back into the extreme power imbalance. And if, after significant efforts, it's not practicable to determine the will and preference of an individual, then the best interpretation of that person's will and preferences must override the best interest determination. Look how important this is. We are doing this for your own benefit, so don't protest. You can't do it according to United Nations Convention. You're not allowed to do it. Stop it, all that nonsense. So what are the common justifications for using force? In my country, we have this one. A person considered insane or in a similar condition can be admitted to a psychiatric ward on an involuntary basis if the prospect of cure or substantial and significant improvement of the condition would otherwise be significantly impaired. Is this ever the case? I don't think so. And aren't the harms far worse than any benefits? I'm convinced they are. The second justification in Denmark is if patients present an obvious and substantial danger to themselves or others, they can be involuntarily admitted. But the national Italian mental health law says that this cannot be a reason. This is a matter for the police. Patients in Italy can furthermore decide where they want treatment. And in Iceland, matter for the police. Same laws for everyone. Are there ethically relevant differences to healthcare that justifies forced treatment in psychiatry? No. We cannot give patients insulin without their permission, not even if the lack of insulin might kill them. We cannot give Jehovah's Witnesses blood if they are adults without their permission, not even if the lack of blood might kill them. The only drugs that can be given without permission to adults are also some of the most dangerous ones. This doesn't make sense. So there are colossal misconceptions. The common law assumption that if a person is unable to give consent, the health professional acts in accordance with what she herself would have preferred, but we really cannot assume that a severely psychotic person would want psychotropic drugs. She might decline drugs because of previous experiences of serious harms. Or her friend died, like in Louise's case. She saw that. Laws about forced treatment build on the harmful misconception that antipsychotics have a specific effect on psychosis, which is good for people. Back in 1975, patients took their fight to the US state courts, and at the same time, Soviet dissidents smuggled out manuscripts describing antipsychotics as the worst form of torture. It's rather difficult to explain that the same substance is a poison in one country and a helpful remedy in another. So what can we do instead of force? Assertive communication rather than running after the patients and intervene in turmoil. Basal exposure therapy, somewhat like treatment of phobia. What they are afraid of, you give in small and increasing doses so that you get used to it. Offering free drug-free alternatives. And actually few people who need to be calmed down will refuse drugs. They will accept them sooner or later, but they are the ones to decide which drugs, how much, and for how long. And psychotherapy works for schizophrenia. We know that now in randomized trials. Open dialogue is a principle I won't have time to go through, but this is about respecting patients where they are, as Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote. This also applies to psychiatry. And then we can call the police if people are dangerous. You can't be a cop and use force and then the next minute come back and establish a fruitful therapeutic relationship with the same person. This is why psychiatrists should stay out of the job of being police. Another important reason is that violence breeds violence. Why are patients with schizophrenia violent? That's often because they have been treated inhumanely. That's exactly why they become violent. Then we have community treatment orders, one of the new fads in psychiatry. Oh yeah, we'll dismiss them from hospital, but we will still enforce drugs on them. This doesn't work either. There is a Cochrane review that shows it doesn't work, and I won't say anything more about that in the interest of time, but some psychiatrists find them unethical and don't use them, and many patients find them stigmatizing. And there is an enormous risk of a catch-22 you cannot come out of. If the patient's distress is manageable, the psychiatrist would say, great, the drugs work. If it is not manageable, they will just force more drugs on the patient because it's not managed. So when will this ever stop? Who is going to decide that? The patients, if you ask me. Then there are some special cases, and then I'll end. For example, anorexia nervosa. If it is life-threatening, we are allowed to intervene, like we can intervene if a patient has insulin coma. We don't need psychiatric laws about forced treatment to do this. This is about helping your neighbor. And what about mania? That's a difficult one. Abandoning forced treatment in psychiatry will produce vastly more good than harm. I have no doubt about that, but some will suffer. For example, some people with mania. But what we need to consider is, for example, chemotherapy will produce vastly more good than harm for some cancers, but some will die from the chemotherapy. That's not a reason to give up chemotherapy. And this is not a reason to give up our struggle against forced treatment, that there are some few cases where it would have been nice to keep a maniac person from using the whole fortune or being unfaithful to his wife or whatever people can do in this state of mind. Oh yes, but overall it's far more harmful to have forced treatment than not. And a psychiatry without force is possible in Iceland. A psychiatrist burned the shackles, straitjackets and other physical restraints in 1932. In Norway, Akershus Hospital doesn't have a regime for rapid tranquilization and has never needed one in the last 20 years. In London, psychiatrists waited on average about 2 weeks before starting antipsychotic medication on newly admitted people. Most people chose to take some medication, often in very small doses. So it is very well possible, these doctors say, that it was respect, time and shelter that helped the patients, not the sub-treatment threshold doses. They respected their patients. And in Trieste in Italy, force is not used. The head of psychiatry argues that you have to completely prohibit coercion, since the employees would otherwise use it and not develop alternatives. That means that coercion is not necessary. So we have places in the world where forced treatment is not used. I would like to see Denmark next. And that was the end. Thank you.
I took part once only, and it made me talkative, I'm sorry, and I stopped. No, I'm sorry. The issue with forced treatment, I think, has another aspect, namely that if you abandon forced treatment, which I support wholeheartedly for obvious reasons, then many patients who are officially in psychiatric treatment do not actually see a whole lot of psychiatrists. That the support from psychiatrists in taking care of their patients and to supporting them with other means than forced treatment and drugs is, in my opinion, extremely deficient. And we would need more psychiatrists, and we should have more psychiatrists if what you say, if what you advocate is going to happen. Thank you.
In the current system, we create a lot of chronic patients and lifelong patients who would have been cured if we had not snowed them under with drugs that put them outside the work market and everything. So I firmly believe, and I think I have some documentation for that, that if we abandon forced treatment and let the patients decide for themselves, we would make far less harm and create far less chronic patients. So actually there would be more labor force among the psychiatrists than right now where they use drugs. I think it's the other way around. But it's not a question of resources, because it's so inhumane to have this system, as you also agreed to. So we must just abolish it, no matter whether it requires more or less resources. But I think it will require less resources. There were 2 doctors who tried to take a dose of haloperidol just to see what it was like. And they described their experiences in the British Medical Journal. It was absolutely horrifying to take one of these antipsychotics. I have sometimes played with the thought that maybe I should take a dose of haloperidol or an antidepressant, but I mean, if I developed akathisia and murdered someone, I mean, the risk is not big, but it is definitely there. Why should I do it? Maybe you think that's not relevant, but it would be interesting to try, but I'm not sure I dare try it. But if we really change this and abandon forced treatment completely, I'm not so convinced it would require more staff. I think it would require less.
My name is Birgitte Bækgaard, and just a comment to the last telling. I would say that there are other kind of staffs also which could be used more in psychiatry, but psychiatry, psychologists, and so on. Well, a comment to your presentation. I would like to put attention to a fact which is very little discussed, and the fact is that about 20 to 25% of the psychotic patients don't profit or benefit of antipsychotic medicine. Even the most hardcore psychopharmacologists believe in that. But despite of that, I wonder why in practice almost every patient, psychotic patient, get medicine.
Yes.
And I think it's important to, be curious about that.
You say that the psychiatrists say that 20 to 25% don't benefit from the antipsychotics. I would say it comes very close to 100%. I just showed you some data from registration material for the newer antipsychotics that the effect on the PANSS scale was so small that it's ridiculously small. I am pretty close to the conclusion that we shouldn't use these terribly toxic drugs at all. But that's my personal view. I underline that.
Diana Christensen from Denmark. Just one clarifying question. Your last slide about mania. You said no treatment for mania. Maybe some patients die, but they also die when they get chemotherapy. But is it ethical to allow mania patients to die when we have a treatment that actually works?
I didn't say we should not treat them. I said we should abandon forced treatment. That's not the same as not treating people. If you talk even to people with mania, I know they can be difficult, but some of them you can actually talk to, and you can get some way, part of the way with them without drugs. What I'm telling you is, if we have an intervention that is more harmful than it's beneficial, then in evidence-based healthcare, you simply stop using that intervention. You don't use it. And if you want to argue for forced treatment to people with mania, you are welcome to do that. I didn't say it was an easy case. I just compared with cancer chemotherapy, where some people die, although most benefit from it. And yeah, I can't solve all problems today, but I can tell you forced treatment must stop. And it has stopped somewhere in the world. Go to Trieste and ask what they do with people with mania.
In Norway, before they decided to sign the Convention for People with Disability, they made a big research about the use of force, and they came up with that it was situated where the psychiatrists were living. So in areas where there was no psychiatrist, they didn't use force. And what this tells me is that the use of force is not delivered because of a need, because in some areas they didn't. So it is more connected to the job to be a psychiatrist. It's a tool to secure his security on the job, in a way. But I would say it's strange that Denmark is not following the convention. But I know that in Spain, when you have signed a convention, it's like the foundation, what it's called,
yeah.
Grundlov.
Yeah.
But not in Denmark and not in some of the other countries. There it's something which have to be implemented in time and so on.
Help me with influencing our Danish politicians in Parliament. We must do something.
Yeah. I just want to say, as a psychiatric survivor and having tried those drugs, they were awful, awful, awful. I can only attest to what Peter is saying. And I'd actually also like to take this opportunity to say, on behalf of the Hearing Voices Network, which is international throughout the whole world, we offer alternatives and we work outside of psychiatry as a post-psychiatric alternative and have great success. And I want to say thank you to Peter, because I think he is the first medical professional and professor who so clearly states his opinion and that he will support the abolition of forced treatment. And I think that is absolutely phenomenal and admirable.
Thank you.
I'm happy you quote from the Disability Convention and also how it is interpreted by the Disability Committee. The reason we came there is that the psychiatric survivor movement succeeded to influence a lot in the UN when this convention was written. We had leading members amongst us with high expertise in international law, and we made very strong allies with all other disability groups. That's why we succeeded and will go on. What we also have to be aware is that in Denmark, community treatment orders have been decided in the parliament, but they're very restricted. Only less than 50 people have been under these treatment orders for the last 4 or 5 years. But how forced treatment really is introduced in the community is by the criminal law. 3,500 psychiatric patients now are under treatment orders decided by the court.
Yeah.
And most of these people never did anything really harmful.
Let me just remind you that what you just said about bending the semantics. please look at the Yes Minister episodes, because reality is pretty close to what they show there in the old BBC series Yes Minister. But we won't give up, Carl. We will find a way around this nonsense.
I give a lot of talks to staff around in psychiatry all over the country, and I really almost always suggest that people should try a low-dose antipsychotic for themselves before they start handing them out. I have yet to meet a staff member who voluntarily tries an antipsychotic. Yet this is called medicine and given to people. And as Peter said, Soviet dissidents described this kind of medication as the worst kind of torture that they experienced. This is the reality for a lot of people under sanctioned and under forced treatment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bertel. I think it's time now, so I'm sorry, but we have to go on.